So I work for this small organization called the Software Freedom Conservancy, and we do a lot of different things, one of which is we spend a lot of time worrying about the future of software freedom and what happens to the four freedoms, the right to copy, share, modify, use, and redistribute software as things change in the world. I noticed that this conference had this theme of the Internet of Things, and they asked for talks specifically about IoT, and always wanting to be able to take a 15-hour flight whenever I can, especially when the organizers are kind enough to pay for it. I made sure I tuned this talk to be as close with the theme of the conference as possible. I actually like it when conferences pick themes because it keeps me from cheating too much when I create talks. Those of us that do a lot of the conference circuit speaking, my colleague Karen Sandler, who's in the back of the room, and I tend to call us the usual suspects who show up at every conference and give a talk, or at least try to get talks accepted. The fact of the matter is we reuse material. The age of recording, hello internet, means that we get to do a lot less of this reusing of material, but I still cheat a little bit. I do promise, however, especially given that Jake Edge is in the room and he wrote an article about a previous talk of mine that does have some degree of overlap with this one, which you can read on LWN. So if you want to leave now and go read that LWN article, it will be 49% overlap with, with this. But for Jake and the rest of you who have seen me speak before, I am promising at least 51%. So the slim majority of this talk will be new content, but there will be 49% of things you've probably heard from me before. I do a lot of work to stay on message, and that's a thing you have to do when you're trying to fight on radical issues, because people who disagree with you will twist your words and all the other things that happen in our world of post-fact politics. So I work very hard to be on message, which means I tend to repeat myself when I give these sort of talks. I long for the days of the whistle-stop tour when you could go to every town and give exactly the same speech and it sounded new to everyone because there was no internet. But it probably is generally a good thing that we have the internet. Whether it's a good thing that we have the Internet of Things is an open question in my view. My goal in this talk is to convince you that we're in deep trouble with regard to IoT, and that copyleft, if regularly and fairly enforced, is a mechanism to get us out of the problems that we're in. Now, it is not a solution to every problem in the world. No idea, no matter how great of an idea it is, solves every problem all of the time. But copyleft solves some of the problems, or at least the beginnings of the problems, most of the time, when used effectively. And that's what I hope to convince you of. I've been to 3 talks that have told this joke, and I'm going to tell it again because I think it matters, that the S in IoT stands for security. Because one of the things that has made free software popular, exciting, and interesting, when you go back to the days that Rusty was talking about this morning on the keynote that he gave this morning, find that in the other videos if you're online, he talked a lot about how hobbyists got excited, and one of the reasons they got excited and got involved in this stuff was because they were like, wow, I can actually write software that's actually secure. I can actually check if it's secure because I can read the source code and rebuild it. The Internet of Things is not really about security. There was a huge set of news in the United States just last month in December that started with this one family who began hearing voices of a nasty person speaking out of their baby monitor. And it was not nice. And this Washington Post journalist did a little research and found that over the entire year of 2018, there were a lot of these incidents where people's Internet of Things devices began talking to them, telling them that inside the little box was a security researcher who was just there to warn them that their IoT device was not secure. I think it's good that security researcher is in quotes there, because I don't think security researchers spend their time breaking into people's doorbells, but it is a scary thing that these devices are not secure. It is a scary thing that these devices phone home. Here in New Zealand, I actually like to travel, well, besides the length of the flight, once I'm here, it's actually very nice because it's only 3 hours difference from the west coast of the US, actually, even though it's yesterday, but 3 hours, which is great. So I can check in on the webcam that we have for our dogs. Now, these webcams we have in my house, they're Internet of Things devices, and they have this great way of getting around firewalls so that you can access them from the internet. All they do is just phone home back to the manufacturer in China and send all the data there so that you can download it back. So I suppose there are Chinese hackers watching my dogs all day. I hope they'll call me if they need water or something, because I haven't had tons of time to go check the cameras because I've been around here at the conference. So I think one of the things we've done very well in our community is we're very good at identifying the problems. That's why there's the S in IoT is for security has been told so many times at this conference. We as technologists, we as people who really understand how software works, know that we're in really big trouble with these devices. And we've identified the problem really well. I think the hard part is taking measures to solve it. I think it's because the problem seems very overwhelming. However, Linux has historically been this great counterexample of how people who are smart and capable and willing to do things in a hobbyist way, willing to do things because they're the right code to write at the right time, not necessarily because it's the code that their employer assigned them to write at a given time, has made an incredibly successful community. And Rusty talked a great deal about that. I am really a big fan of his way of looking at this community as a community of hobbyists first and foremost, because that's how I came to this community. So this is my laptop from 1992, or very close to it anyway. I couldn't find an exact image of the Sager. This is a Toshiba model that was probably made in the same factory because it looks so similar to the one that I had. And I got this in 1992, and it had Windows 3.1 on it. And I had recently learned that there was a thing called SLS, Soft Landing System, which was a series of floppies that I could put into this thing and install Linux. And it didn't work, not surprisingly. There were a number of things I had to do to fix it, and I fixed them. Really mostly commented code out in the kernel, which is really all I ever, my big contributions, I commented code out I didn't want. But I was able to recompile and reinstall Linux on this. The thing didn't come with Linux. You couldn't find a laptop in 1992 that had Linux pre-installed. You couldn't find any devices in 1992 that had Linux pre-installed. If you wanted to run Linux, you downloaded it on floppies and installed it yourself. That was essential to our community. The ability to reinstall, the ability to get commercial off-the-shelf hardware and install it is what made this community great. We have, how many people in the room are running Linux on their laptops? Right, so this is LCA, so basically everybody raised their hand, almost everybody raised their hand, right? Well, the hobbyist culture made that possible. The fact that you all in this room, that lots of people watching this video run Linux on their laptops is because people have spent a tremendous amount of time making it work. The fact of the matter is, the manufacturers of laptops to this day do not really sell Linux-based laptops. You can buy them, they exist, but I bet how many people in this room bought a laptop that had Linux already installed on it? Okay, so about 4% of the room got that, right? It's not that it's impossible to do this. It's not that it's impossible to find a pre-installed laptop, but if you look at the entire laptop market, which is now much larger than it was in 1992, percentage-wise, it's only slightly easier because it's only nudged up slightly from 0%, the number of manufacturers, the number of laptops sold that will offer you a Linux pre-install, and it changes here every once in a while. Once upon a time, I bought a pre-installed Linux laptop in 2006-ish. That company no longer does pre-installed Linux anymore. So this is a thing that we need to do to be able to use and run free software. We have to be able to buy hardware on the open market and install a Linux distribution on it. If I came into this room and told you, I do not think it matters that much if you can install Linux on a laptop, would you find that a reasonable position? Of course not. Not at LCA, anyway. But that's exactly what we're being told with IoT. The funny part is that Linux is commonly pre-installed on devices. Specifically, IoT devices generally have Linux pre-installed. So while you still can't buy a laptop with Linux pre-installed, more or less, 2 to 4% of the market you can, the rest of it you can't. Every time you buy an IoT device, 90+% of the time, it has Linux pre-installed. And if I were to stop right there, as a message, if we go back to 1992 and say, do you know that 90% of the small device market that has computing in it will have Linux pre-installed? In 1992, we all would have been thrilled to hear that. Like, wow, we got there, we made it. The problem is, while similar to the people who can buy pre-installed laptops with Linux, a very small percentage of people who buy an IoT device with Linux pre-installed can actually reinstall Linux themselves. Very, very few people do this. The fact of the matter is very, very few people can actually reinstall Linux on their IoT device. Most IoT devices don't make it possible to reinstall Linux on the device. So I see that as even worse than the laptop problem. The reason it's worse is because while I'm a huge fan and was so excited when I saw mainstream news coverage in the mid-90s of the march on Microsoft that was done by the Silicon Valley Linux group, that they were demanding their Windows licensing fees back. It was a very, very great thing of protest that was done. The fact of the matter was, it doesn't matter if we get our Windows licensing fees back from the laptops we buy, because we can really just delete it and install Linux. It's annoying that Microsoft gets the money. Okay, we all agree about that. But it doesn't stop us from pushing forward to the future of free software, because we can install Linux and move on, and Microsoft gets a little bit of cash and we'll live with it. The fact of the matter is, the GPL is one of the most forward-looking documents ever written, at least in software. Because while the world of 1992 did not contemplate IoT, did not really contemplate embedded devices, it had the words in it we needed to solve this problem. It was already there in the GPL from the very beginning. The scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. The GPL just doesn't require the source code by itself. It requires the things around the source code to be disclosed to the person who received the device so that they can effectively make use of their software freedom. Stallman, when he drafted the GPL, thought about this question and understood fully that it didn't matter so much if you had software freedom if all you had was the freedom to study, which is only one of the 4 freedoms. The freedom to study is not enough. It is essential but not complete. You need the freedom to modify and the freedom to install modified versions, and the GPL guarantees that. And we're very fortunate that Linux is under the GPL version 2, which has that text. So IoT is really just a buzzword. I think this is probably one of the first IoT devices that ever existed. It was the thing that you put into your house to connect you to the internet and connect your machines over the air to the internet, which was a revolutionary thing. Those of us that are old enough to remember, Rusty mentioned how early conferences you didn't have network access. Like Rusty, when I started going to conferences, wireless 802.11 technology had not been, it probably had been invented, but had not been deployed yet. You went to a conference and you were off the grid. It was a weird thing. I was not surprised when I heard they printed out Slashdot and put it on the board in those days. This device was the beginning of IoT. And this one, we handled right because we realized early what was going on and did something about it. This was the first major product that a large coalition of individuals and organizations enforced the GPL for. And not only did a release come from Linksys and Cisco of software for that device, but also that package of source code became now SVN days, not Git, SVN R1 of the OpenWRT project. Unfortunately, I've been looking, if anybody has it, I would love to have the SVN tree from the original OpenWRT so I can look at that R1 and have a screenshot of that. Fortunately, I have this history page up that you can look at that tells the story, that the first thing they started with. And I remember looking at that years ago. I remember being very excited about it because I had worked personally on the OpenWRT enforcement. That R1's comment was, sources as received from Linksys from GPL enforcement. That's how that project started. That project now is the industry standard. It has handled problem after problem that the industry has pushed in our face. The buffer boat problem was addressed by the OpenWRT community in collaboration with many others, but the fact that we could deploy firmwares that people could replace the poor firmwares they were given, that were insecure, that were using the network poorly, with software that we as hobbyists created ourselves. That was what Linux was about. That's what software freedom is about. My worry is that will we get another OpenWRT? There are very few products that have an alternative firmware project, and none of them are the size, breadth, scope, and resiliency of the OpenWRT project. This is, in my view, the biggest problem we face in free software, because so many devices now are digital, and so many devices now run Linux. So many devices now threaten our privacy, security, our very existence. And we need the source code for them to be able to solve all those problems. And we don't just need the source code, we need the ability to effectively use the source code, to recompile it and install it. Even before IoT existed, we were doing enforcement through the BusyBox project on would-be IoT devices or early IoT devices. We were successful at getting an excellent source release for a Samsung TV model because of the lawsuits. Samsung did not willingly give that source release. They gave it after a year and a half of litigation in courts, finally said, we realize we're doing the wrong thing and we have to release this. It was good enough that a project launched. This project is floundering now, but this project was able to launch because that source release was a good standard of what the GPL requires, and they were able to form a community, a small one, that at least for some models of Samsung TVs could do an alternative firmware. I do not understand, truly, why the hardware manufacturers don't love this. I don't understand why they don't want to sell us more hardware. It baffles me just like it's baffled all of us for years with the laptops. Why do they not want to support Linux? After all, we might be a small community, but we are consumers, right? We are buying stuff. We probably buy more electronics than most of the consumers, by far. And therefore, they should want us to buy it. And if they gave us the hardware that allowed us to put our modified firmwares on, we would promote them, we would build more stuff for them, we would sell more devices. That wireless router, the WRT54G, it is the wireless router that is the longest time in production in history of all wireless routers, certainly, and possibly all digital devices ever. You can still buy a WRT54G, not on eBay as a used item, but new. Because Linksys still pumps it out because people hear about it and say, oh, that's the thing that runs OpenWRT. I will go buy it, even though it's now a effectively 20-year-old piece of technology. They've occasionally updated some of the chips in it, but generally speaking, it's pretty much at least the same form factor and mostly the same boards that were in the original one. GPL enforcement can make this stuff happen. It already has. We've proven that it is successful at assuring we get the right to copy, share, modify, redistribute, and reinstall our software. We just need to do more of it. The problem we face today is that there's a disconnect between two very important parts of our community. I don't make friends in the Linux Foundation when I say this, but I think it's accurate. I think that Linux upstream, too often, focuses on the needs of their large corporate users and ignores from time to time, quite often these days, the needs of the individual downstream hobbyist user. In fact, in discussions as Conservancy began its efforts to enforce the GPL for Linux, I was told by not just one, but many, a version of this statement from the Linux upstream. I was talking about this issue of, well, scripts used to control compilation, installation, and executable. And as upstream Linux developers are occasionally want to do, at least their leadership, they like to take, I would say, take the GPL cafeteria style. They kind of pick and choose which parts of the GPLs matter most to them. Even though the license of Linux is GPL, there are some clauses they care more about than others. And they were very clear, at least a few of the leadership, that they just didn't care about the scripts used to control compilation and installation and executable. They said, really, we just want C files. That's all that's useful to us as upstream. We want what they changed in the C files. They didn't change anything in the C files. We don't really care what they did with it. Matthew said this best. I'm going to pause for a moment and let everybody read that slide, because Matthew put this better much more than I did when there was an argument about GPL enforcement on a Linux mailing list. Oh, sorry, it's not in real time. I was asked if I could make it bigger, not in real time. So I'll give the gist of it for those in the back. The point Matthew makes here is that the types of technological endeavor that's being done Linux upstream is the type of intellectual and software endeavor that is most needed for large companies doing large things with big data and various other technologies that the average daily consumer does not have the hardware to possibly do. Matthew also points out that the very people that are now the leaders in Linux, they all got their start just as Rusty did, as he explained in the keynote this morning, as being an individual sitting on their own computer hacking on Linux. A bunch of students, as Rusty pointed out, ported Linux to Spark on computers that just happened to be in front of them at the time. We will find the next generation of developers from those hobbyists, not from the giant walls of IBM and other big corporations. The hobbyists are the ones who become the developers in the next generation, and it is an egalitarian effect, because if all you need to become a Linux hacker is a laptop and an IoT device, it means lots and lots of people of lots of different income and diverse backgrounds have an opportunity. And it's yet another vector where we don't get domination by wealthy, privileged people who have access to the technology. My excitement about GPL and free software, and Matthew's excitement that he's explaining here, was you didn't need anything but a computer and an internet connection to become an upstream developer in those days. And that's becoming less and less true. And if we solve this problem on IoT, we'll get back to the way it was, which I think was better in the sense that it allowed people, and that allows us to move on other fronts we want to move on, like diversity, because we have the opportunity to hand young children devices that they can actually become real developers on. Ultimately, there's this disconnect, and there always has been, between developers and users. The interesting thing about free software is it generally blurred that line. It said, you start out as a user, but you don't have to stay that way. You don't have to be just a user. You can be a developer when you're ready. And there's always the moment in front of you that you can become that, because the source code's always sitting right there next to you. And when you feel ready, when you feel confident enough to give it a try, you can give it a try. I worry about what we get for upstream developers if we're only focusing on the big problems, as it were, the big data problems building in the cloud. If the only thing you can install Linux on in a few years is a rack-mounted server, maybe a laptop, and a VPS cloud host, and everything else that's running Linux, only the manufacturer can install it, that's a dystopia. That's why I chose that word for the talk. I think we won the do-it-yourself battle on the laptop. I think we have we can be sure for the foreseeable future that we're okay on the laptop. But in IoT devices, we've lost this battle completely at the moment, and we have to regain ground. I've been often misquoted about my views with regard to Linux and how it interacts with the GPL and what's important. I will mince no words so that I don't get misquoted. Linux is the most important GPL program in the history of software. It may be the most important program ever written in history, period. But the reason that it was successful, and I worry about history being rewritten on this point, it was successful because, not in spite of, the GPL. It was successful because there was a license that assured everyone got the same and equal rights to copy, share, modify, redistribute, and rebuild the software. And because users could install it on their own devices, because as a second-year undergraduate in 1992, I could download it on a bunch of floppies in the lab and have a running Unix-like workstation that was better than the DEC Unix systems that were available in the lab, that changed the course of my career, certainly. And there are plenty of people, not just me and Rusty, but lots of people whose careers changed because they got direct access to real professional source code very early in their careers. I believe that Linux can't keep its place on the top. The Linux upstream cares deeply about the future of Linux. Reasonably so. They want their project to survive. I think they are erring in that they don't worry about what happens with all these IoT devices. I think they err when they say, well, does it really matter if you can upgrade your light bulb? I say, yes, it matters. If it's running Linux, it matters. I think tinkering is what makes free software great. And if people cannot tinker, we don't have free software anymore. I don't want this talk to be quoted as saying, I think upstream doesn't matter. Upstream does matter. Upstreaming code is important. Learning how to upstream code is an important professional activity that you should study and get good at. But ultimately, downstream matters more than upstream. I'm sorry to say, if you're a developer of an upstream project, your users are more important than you. It's not about you. Yes, thousands of people are upstream Linux developers. That's amazing. The idea, I would never have imagined in 1992 that thousands of people would be in the Git log, and didn't imagine Git would exist, but there are thousands of people who end up in the revision control logs of Linux. But I really didn't imagine that 2 billion people would have Linux on their devices either. That is much more surprising than there's thousands of Linux developers, that there's 2 billion people who are potential Linux developers, but being thwarted because they can't possibly reinstall Linux on their phone. Because it's locked down, because it's too hard, because the various different mod firmwares haven't gotten to that reverse engineering job yet, which it usually is to get it running. I do see Linux upstream as our friends and colleagues. I think we can have reasonable disagreements about this sort of stuff and continue to work together. I had a long, you might have all seen me out there having a long conversation with a key Linux developer who gave me a lot of his time yesterday to talk about a lot of these issues. In fact, I said to somebody later, I think he was just being polite, and they said, well, that person, how long did you talk to him? I said, 1 hour and 15 minutes, and said, even he's not that polite. If he didn't want to talk to you, he would have walked away earlier. I said, well, that's good to hear. You know, they're willing to give us our time and talk about this, but I really believe there is a silent plurality and a loud minority who really, really care about these issues, who really want to see these IoT devices reinstallable, hackable, changeable, and studyable so that you can figure out the security and the privacy implications of what's going on with these devices. It's not like having the source code for just the kernel is going to be enough to get us there. But it is a necessary, even if not sufficient, condition. We have to be able to look at the kernel first, because if you want to put something nasty, that's the best place to put it. You only put it in user space when you really have to. You'd rather have the kernel spying on you if you're somebody who wants to spy on people. The fact of the matter is, the license of Linux is set. It was picked. It's very hard to change, as is often talked about. It's GPLv2 only. And GPLv2 is a really great license because it assures software freedom for people downstream, whether those clauses are the most interesting to upstream or not. I think we just have to work together to take advantage of that opportunity. I used to, I dabbled in anarchism as a youth. And I used to think, revolution. I remember going to a protest march once, and one of the chants was revolution, not reform. I was real excited about that at 17 years old. Revolution, not reform. The fact of the matter is we don't actually need revolution. This is the great thing about things like Copyleft, because there were people thinking ahead to say, well, gee, we need to put something in place that will allow us to not need a revolution. Software freedom has not been a revolution. It's been incremental progress by using tools that make sure we don't get exploited by the other side. The GPL has what we need in it already. We just have to enforce it. We just have to make sure it's used properly. We just need to take back our software freedom that's already sitting for us there in the rights outlined already. It's not like we are living in an oppressive societies. I mean, some of us are in the world, but New Zealand, Australia, United States are reasonably free societies, right? It's not like we need a revolution to have software freedom. We have reasonably good democracies, and we have freedom outlined for us in the founding constitution of our community, the GPL. So there are active things you can be doing that you're not doing right now that I'm going to ask you to do. While I think we have the tools we need, it doesn't mean classically freedom is free mixing the two meanings of freedom. There's work to be done. Mixing the two meanings of free. There's work to be done. When you get a device and it looks like it has Linux in it, the GPL says there has to be an offer for source code. The companies are counting on you not asking for the source code. We know from years of GPL enforcement that they figured out early on. So early on when we did GPL enforcement, what we did was we just checked if there was an offer for source, and if there was no offer for source, we knew they were violating because there was free software in it, so they didn't give the source code, they didn't give an offer. Quick, we found a violation. So companies discovered this is the extent of what we were doing, so they came up with the fake offer for source. They made an offer for source with no intention of ever honoring it, and figuring, well, if they look in our manual, they'll see an offer for source, they'll move on to the next product when they look at it. So we had to start requesting the source code. That is still where we are today. That source code offer needs to be tested every time. And the other problem is that it's tested so rarely, these companies assume that no one actually cares about this. Even if you don't have time or inclination or desire to do anything with the source, every time you buy a Linux-based device, make sure you have the source code or something that looks like it. And if you don't, request it. If you can't get it, if you're able to or have time, actually try to build the stuff. Try to get it reinstalled if you can. I know it will sometimes brick your device, but that's not supposed to happen, which means they're probably violating the GPL. So try to build it, and if you don't know how to build it, ask a friend to work with you, post on the internet that you're trying to build it. Create a culture where people say, I actually test the source offer and try to make it work. Because it will increase the knowledge in the community that these source releases are often incomplete. Because people say, oh, I heard about a GPL violation. Oh, I heard they released the sources. But we live in the world of fake news. We live in the world of post-fact politics. So very few people actually ever check to see, is that really the source? Is it really complete? Does it really build? You can make a big difference by creating a culture where we actually check. And we actually talk publicly. Hey, I was checking. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Did anybody else have this product? Did you get it working? And if it doesn't work, they violated the GPL. It's that simple. You were promised a Bill of Rights in the GPL, and you didn't get those rights. You can report the violation. Unfortunately, the only organization enforcing on behalf of the community right now is the organization I work for, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and we're small. We may or may not be able to get to your particular violation and resolve it because we have thousands of reports sitting there waiting for us. But having the catalog of reports is very valuable. Having a single place where we've collected how bad the problem is useful for us when we give talks like this. It's useful for the community to know that somebody's out there as a watchdog. For better or worse, we are the watchdog organization of the GPL now, and we need your help to continue that work. The big ask is that I'm hoping there's at least one person in the audience who is willing to spend the time as a hobbyist, because no one's going to fund this in the industry. For-profit companies don't want to do this. But just like OpenWRT, hobbyists made an alternative firmware for wireless routers. pick your favorite IoT device, get the source release, get it building, and let's start making alternative firmwares for these. Every single device, every single type of device at least, needs an alternative firmware project. Everyone needs one now, today, and so few people are working on it. If you're excited about what an IoT device does, you can be the leader of that project. Like Rusty talked about, it's showing up is basically it to make this thing happen. Revolutions are run by people who show up. I know this seems insurmountable. It feels insurmountable to me most days. But I think we've been led astray by this idea that it doesn't matter, that whether you can rebuild Linux or not for your device doesn't matter. It does matter. We know it matters because of the laptop problem that we're still fighting. Every Linux licensee has the GPL-given right to be able to reinstall Linux on your IoT device. It's there for the taking. We just have to fight for it. Just exercise your rights that you already have. I haven't talked a lot about the privacy and security problems. I use that as my setup. I'm not saying that if we all just install a version of Linux we built from sources ourselves, all the things will protect our privacy and our security. I know that won't happen overnight, but it's the first step forward. Because that's exactly what happened with OpenWRT. We saw it. Like first they got Linux building, and now there are tons of plugin modules in OpenWRT that help you automatically use third-party VPN services to protect your privacy, all that sort of stuff. Those kinds of technologies were made easy for people because they had the base firmware to start from. So every one of these devices needs that base firmware to start from so people can write privacy protecting, security protecting, own cloud, personal cloud kind of ideas where you control all the devices in your home rather than someone else. The stuff that Kathy's working on in Mozilla, that can happen better when they have a base firmware to build on top of this free software. Am I right? Yeah, Kathy's saying right. So I think the balance of power can be restored because we did it already on the desktop, on our laptops, on our servers, by being able to install our own copies of Linux. I've got 10 minutes left. I'd be happy to take questions.
Hello. I enjoyed your talk.
Thank
It was
you.
wonderful. I just had a quick question about if you have any recommendations for a proper way to ask for the source code. Is email good enough, or have you any recommendations on ways that you will actually be taken seriously by the company that you're asking?
So it's an obligation they have, and it's not your obligation to do it in the perfect form that they want. If they haven't told you how to ask for it, you should use whatever means are at your disposal. If you have an email address for them, email them. They may ignore you. They probably will ignore you. I have a different tact in this because we're often trying to set up a clear record that they didn't answer, because by the time it gets to me, someone has already tried all the mundane means, and we do things like send certified return receipt overnight letters to prove that we tried to contact them and so forth. But they should be responsive. In fact, they should be telling you in the manual how to request the source. The requirements of GPL require the offer for source actually work. And so the offer for source should say, to get the source code, email this address or visit this website or whatever it is. And if the sources are not there, they're already in GPL violation land. Be polite, be friendly, but be persistent.
Cool, thanks very much. One fear that, or one problem that I see with a lot of Internet of Things devices, and generally I try to keep them out of my home, is yes, I could possibly compile it on my own machine, but there is no instruction on how to actually get it into the hardware. And if we're ending up with devices which are welded shut, or where the pins to write a firmware onto it are snipped off or something like that, then building it is one thing. Where is the GPL on that sort of hardware side?
So the word install is an interesting one, and the word script is an interesting one. So when developers hear scripts, they think, oh, that means bash scripts. Well, a judge is not going to look at that and know what a bash script is. They're probably going to think first of a script for a play, which tells you all the lines you have to say so that you're actually performing that work. Well, I think that's what the GPL means there. And I think if there are a set of steps you have to go through, which might include standing on your head or wiring two pins together or whatever to make the installation work, you should be told that. And if you look during the BusyBox cases, those instructions we got from Samsung included a JTAG pinout as part of the instructions that they gave us. So while settled court cases, which that is, does not set precedent in the formal legal sense, it is an industry precedent, even if not a legal one, that says that kind of source release that tells you how to actually install the firmware on the TV is what the GPL requires. And I will continue to maintain that. From my point of view, that's Conservancy's job. If you get to the point where you say, wait a second, this is GPL, this has Linux on it, and I can't install it, you email us and we'll talk about what we can do about it. Because I think that's something that we should push on. It is not popular in the industry because the industry doesn't want to allow people to reinstall. And if they can get away with not allowing people to reinstall in the ways that you're talking about, they will do so. Our job is to challenge that as hobbyists and enthusiasts and people who care about software freedom. So the best thing you can do is hit that wall. I know that sounds weird, but it's better if you find out what devices are not doing the right thing so we can do something about it. Because we all know probably there are devices out there that do that, but I don't know a list off the top of my head because you all out there aren't bringing that list to us saying, hey, I've got 5 IoT devices, I tried to install Linux on every one and none of it worked, and here's the way it didn't work. So then we can go to the company and say, that's a violation of the GPL.
So what happens when it is possible to get and build the firmware, but then the process of writing the firmware, the hardware required to write the firmware into the device is possible, but involves thousands of dollars worth of hardware just to write your firmware in? For example, many IoT makers will create their firmware blob, they will send it off to the ROM manufacturer, and it'll be pre-programmed once and never programmable again. How do we deal with that going even further?
So I agree with you that such devices exist in the world. I think they are rarer on the open market than they used to be, because I have not for a long time seen an IoT device that doesn't allow over-the-air upgrades. People have written large articles about how insecure this is, that they just, oh, if you have a good SSL certificate, I'll just take this, I'll take this firmware for you and install it on myself. But if it can do that, the GPL, from my point of view, says you should be able to put your own firmware over-the-air installer in between it and be able to install it yourself. Certainly, if you burn Linux into ROM, there is a lot of discussion about what that install instructions mean, and I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards about kind of what comes out of that. But I don't think it's the regular case anymore, because I don't think manufacturers want to make devices that turn into bricks the moment there's a bug in Linux that bothers them. Not that the security bugs bother them that much, but there's probably some bugs that bother them that they want to do the upgrade as well. So field upgradability is pretty much the industry standard now, from what I've seen.
Do you or does someone have a directory or clearinghouse of which devices are known to be in compliance or known to be out of compliance? Like, I mean, I can go through a bunch of trouble to figure out how to contact my manufacturer, but like you might already have the source code just like sitting on your computer.
So we made sure that any source code that we've gotten released under enforcement is being complied with properly, i.e. if you go back to them to ask for that source code, they should be giving you the release that we vetted. So in those cases, you're going to get the source code back. You may not even know the Conservancy had done the enforcement matter there. You'll just happen to have source code that works, which is a good thing, because we'd rather you just be able to do the normal process. As far as a clearinghouse of violations, that has been often proposed. When we wrote the principles of community-oriented GPL enforcement, we thought a lot about this question of confidentiality about violators. Our general feeling is still what the principles say, which is we don't want GPL violations to be frontline news the first day it's found. The OpenWRT situation took about a year longer than it should have because people got impatient and put it on Slashdot. To this day, Sherman Chu, who was at that time the head of legal at Cisco, now he works elsewhere. He still to this day believes that I did that in a way to put pressure on him or something that in the middle of the process, which in fact it was just a third party that did that, and it really made the negotiations more difficult. So we're more of a fan of trying to at least contact the company first. We want to believe, while I have my suspicions it's not true, we want to believe every company intended to comply from the start and it was just a mistake. Less and less is that true anymore, but I think we should still go in with that friendly assumption of, oh, you made a mistake, let's help you, which means making it public and admonishing them publicly as a first step is not a good idea.
Let's suppose, very much following on that theme, let's suppose I find an IoT device, request software, and they magically give it to me. And then I make modifications or don't, and I publish that code. Does that, as an individual, does that expose me to extra risk in this world? Is that something that's happening?
Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer and I can't give you legal advice. But hypothetically speaking, you are a GPL licensee. You've received software in the GPL. You've now made modifications, which means you also are a GPL copyright holder because you've modified Linux and redistributed it. So you have rights of your own as a copyright holder, as well as the rights that you got from the other copyright holders who gave it to you. You also have upstream developers involved who are copyright holders. So the company in the middle that gave it to you, while they may hold copyright, there's thousands of other people who also hold copyright. So if it were me, I would not be worried at all. And I would be very glad to fight the case where somebody tried to do that. So if you ever get told that, definitely call us and we'll try to figure out what to do. We're not a law firm, so we can't be your lawyers, but we can certainly provide logistical support for people in that situation.
We're all out of time, folks. Thank you for your questions. Please take a picture of the screen on your way out. Please, if you can afford to, send money to the Software Conservancy. Please download and read the Copyleft guide and take action based on that. This stuff is as important or more important than writing code. Thanks for your day.